medieval universities. Yeah. Early medieval universities in Europe, they were established around the period 12th to 13th centuries. Yeah. Universities like in Italy, Bologna, Salerno, and in France, University of Paris, in England, University of Oxford. They were, of course, related to religious authorities. Yeah. But the fact was that they could not have set up these universities without a body of knowledge to base their learning on. Yeah? And where does that knowledge come from? It is largely through the translated works which European scholars carried out based on the rediscovery of Greek knowledge through Muslim sources, through the libraries of Cordoba and Toledo, Spain. Because Spain, as we know, was under Muslim rule until 1492, from 711 to 1482. But earlier than 1492, there have been parts of Spain which were reconquered by the Christians. Yeah, and that enabled them to access the Muslim libraries in Cordoba and Toledo. And that was where they rediscovered the knowledge of the Greeks and the Muslims and translated them back into Latin. Yeah? And so that enabled the revival of learning in Europe. And this is something which we can find in history of science books written by Western scholars themselves. I mean, it's not something which I, as a Muslim, propagate as a part of my parochial view on the matter. It's something which is acknowledged by Western historians. It is a historical fact. But the further claim I'm making here is that the universities in Europe would not have been established without the knowledge base. Yeah? Because the philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, the science of Euclid, the science of Ptolemy's astronomy, and so on, they were acquired through the translated works of the Muslims. Yeah? If you say that the Renaissance, which was associated with the revival of learning, took place in the 16th century in Italy, then that would have been too late, because the universities in Europe, medieval universities, were established much earlier than the 16th century. Yeah? So it could not have been based on the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance of the 16th century, the establishment of the medieval university. So to me, this is a crucial point which Muslims themselves need to understand. Yeah? Europe's debt to Islam in terms of knowledge development. And only history can give us this kind of insight, and therefore provide us with the confidence which we are currently lacking because of the lack of knowledge of history. Okay, can we move on? Okay. Now, moving on from history, I now enter the territory of philosophy. Yeah? Because as I've said, the two disciplinary tools which I'll be using in analyzing the relationship between Islam and science are, number one, history of science, and number two, the philosophy of science. And this would be another field of knowledge that would contribute tremendously towards understanding of the relationship between Islam and science, and perhaps resolve some of the important issues in the relationship between Islam and science, especially in terms of epistemology and philosophy. Okay. Before we can gain an understanding of how this could possibly be achieved, i.e., how philosophy of science can throw light on the relationship between Islam and science, I have first of all to make clear the distinction between science and the philosophy of science. Yeah? So can we move to the next slide? Okay. Now, if we regard science as occupying what I would call the object level, where science serves as the object of analysis, then the philosophy of science would occupy the level above it, which is the meta level. Yeah? So you can imagine philosophy as being at the upper level, meta level, reflecting on science, which is at the object level. Yeah. So they are not equivalent, they're not equal in terms of the status as far as the epistemological analysis is concerned. One serves as the object of the analysis, which is science, and the other, which is philosophy, exists at the meta level and reflects on that object, which is science. Yeah? Thus, philosophical pronouncements on science is different from the object, on the subject or content of science itself. So in other words, what I'm saying is that science is science. It is one and the same. Yeah. But philosophical views of science can vary and can be different. You could have philosopher A saying that science is such and such, and philosopher B saying that science is not that way. It's some other such and such. So in other words, you could have different philosophical interpretations of science. And in the scholarly world, this is perfectly acceptable. Yeah. For example, we have in the West debates between followers of Karl Popper and followers of Karl and Thomas Kuhn on what the nature of scientific knowledge is. Yeah? And they don't say that, well, this indicates something wrong with the world of knowledge. No. It's part of the tradition in the humanities to differ on their views of certain things. Yeah? There is a pluralism rather than monism of ideas or viewpoints with regard to the humanities, and this is fairly normal in Western academic intellectual tradition. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So again, my point here is that science, it consists of the various natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology, is one and the same. You don't have a Russian physics or an American physics or Christian physics or Muslim physics. Physics is physics. It is made of the same set of theories: relativity theory, quantum theory, electromagnetism, and so on. That is what makes up physics. It's one and the same, but the philosophies of science, which looks at physics, which looks at science, they can vary and they can be different. And here I'm again giving the example of the two famous philosophers of science of the 20th century, because I was educated in that tradition. I had to read Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn over and over again, because those were the two influential philosophers in the Western world. Yeah, but they took radically different positions on the nature of science. Yeah? The science they refer to and reflect upon, such as physics, is one and the same. But the philosophy of science that they formulated are not one and the same. It's highly debatable, highly contested, yeah, by the two schools of thought. Yeah. Popper is more of a modernist philosopher who retains that earlier Enlightenment idea of science as being rational, objective, progressive, and true, whereas Kuhn tends towards a more postmodernist approach towards science, where those modernist assumptions are rejected. So the idea of science being completely rational is mentioned by Kuhn by his idea of incommensurability of theories and paradigm shifts and so on, but where the paradigm shifts are not based on any logical or rational criteria. And the notion of science, scientific change as leading to some sort of ultimate truth is again challenged by Kuhn, where he says that there is no convergence toward a singular picture of the universe. What we have is alternation between one picture and another, and there is no convergence, so there is no sort of progression towards truth. So, although they are reflecting on the same science, but they could come up with different views on the nature of science. And this is me and it's the interesting part about philosophy as opposed to science itself, because philosophy makes it possible to achieve some sort of cultural accommodation of science, yeah, to suit one's cultural values, yeah, without necessarily being terribly prejudicial or distorted in one's views about science. And I'll move on to the next slide. Now, again, here, I want to impress upon you the role occupied by philosophers of science in society and culture. Yeah. Uh, their role as what I would say the cultural bearers of science through their formulation and projection about the nature and image of science. Yeah. Because if you think about it, our idea of the nature of science is not obtained by reading the works of scientists, empirical or theoretical scientists. Real physicists or real chemists, they are too busy carrying out their research either in the lab or in their office if they are theoretical physicists. To them, is a diversion from their core business. If they were to articulate their views on the nature of scientific knowledge, whether it is rational, empirical, or whether it has its own limitations and so on. Yeah? That is not the job of the natural scientists. Their job is to develop knowledge in their various specialties in science. Yeah. So it is left to the philosophers of science, or currently not only the philosophers but also the historians and the sociologists of science, to articulate that image of science and present it to the public, especially to what I would call the educated layman. Yeah. So that image of science is the doing of the philosophers of science, or the historians of science, or the sociologists of science, not of the scientists themselves. Yeah. So the kind of philosophies that are projected would then influence one's view and image of science. Okay, let's move on. And I've said Karl Popper and Thomas mentioned. Okay. Now, what the scenario tells us is that there is a contestation for the image of science in the academic world. Yeah. Philosopher A would say that science is objective and rational. Philosopher B would say that no, science is subjective, perhaps, or influenced by social factors, that like what the social constructivists are claiming. They say that science, like other forms of knowledge, they are social constructions where human interests and values influence the production of scientific knowledge. So it's not completely objective in that sense. Yeah? And they have arguments to support that claim. Yeah? So it's a contestation for the image of science to suit their own about culture and modernity. Yeah. And Muslim scholars and thinkers have joined the fray which was engaged in by Western thinkers earlier. They were joined in later by Muslim intellectuals such as Syed Hussein Nas, Jawin Sada, and our own Malaysian Syed Najib Alatas, yeah, who also offered their own views of science, but from an Islamic perspective. So they have joined the fray and entered this contestation in the arena of intellectual thought. And this kind of dialectical engagement by Muslim thinkers, I think, is a healthy development. Yeah, because it ensures that the West do not have a monopoly over the discourse on science or on the image of science, or on science and religion. That Muslims, though, have their own intellectual capacity to articulate their own views about the nature of science and technology and so on from an Islamic perspective. And that this engagement is not one-sided. The views presented by Muslim scholars, as Said Hussein Nas, is highly respected even by the West. Yeah. So that sort of role is, as I've said, played by the philosopher of science. And in this case, Said Hussein Nas are considered a philosopher of science, although taking an Islamic position on the issue. So the value, as I've written here, the value of such philosophical reflection Muslims enable them to reflect on science and its place on Islamic culture and system. And thus, accommodating science within or into Islamic thought and culture. He does not reject science, but rather it's therefore most called Islamization of knowledge. As I see it, is also another Muslim concerns or Muslim. Okay, my concluding remarks. Involved in science fiction, we can get an idea of what the discourse from such a discourse. And hopefully we can clarify some of the issues involved and lead to a much better understanding of Islam and science, which would then further lead to a better acceptance of science within the Islamic world and provide Muslims with greater confidence in carrying out the task of reviving the Muslim Ummah through the proper utilization of science and technology in a way which is not alien to our culture, to our Islamic culture, or alien to our belief. And doing so in a way which does not sacrifice or compromise the authenticity of the Islamic faith and religious practice. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. A very substantial presentation. I think it's very enlightening even for us who has zero background of Islam and science. We have many questions in our chat box. I will choose which one is relevant for today. We take first from Brother Abdullahi Ibrahim. One, what can we say is the scientific theory in Islam or in the glorious Quran?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. What can we say is the scientific theory in Islam? I mean, from Islamic perspective, what or in the Quran?
Well, to me, as a scientific theory is scientific theory. The theory is, if it's a theory in physics, then it tells us about the nature of the physical world. So, to me, science is science, and there is little that one can project onto it in terms of actually where we go from there. I think that's where religion comes in. I mean, like, for example, a physicist like Stephen Hawking says that there is no creator to the world. Yeah. So when he makes that sort of statement, to me, he's going beyond his capacity as a scientist. The metaphysicians, whether science actually, whether the physical world has a creator or not. And this is precisely the point that Al-Ghazali was saying, that one should distinguish between metaphysics and physics. So one can be a great physicist, like Stephen Hawking, but can deny the existence of a creator of the world. And to me, where our Islamic belief comes in is when such contested view and contentious view, like Hawking, the absolute later, that's where I can sort of put down my Muslim foot down. Yeah. But as far as his physics is concerned, then I would leave it as it is. Yeah. Okay.
I think this question from Brother Fakra, Sister Fakra is too long. I will forward to you later on. We take from Brother Nuruddin. Prof, can you explain how the position of science, natural sciences, in the Islamization of knowledge project? There are some critics who claim that the Islamization of knowledge only targets social science, but ignores the Islamization of natural science. Please respond.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is quite true, partly because of the differences in the nature of the natural sciences as compared to the social sciences. Yeah? Because as Kuhn has rightly pointed out, in the natural sciences, like for example in physics, you only have one dominant paradigm existing at any period of time. Yeah? Perhaps with a few exceptions, like for example in physics, you have sometimes two theories which are not completely incompatible, but so the dominance of a paradigm implies that it is a monoparadigmatic state in the natural sciences. Yeah? But in the social sciences, it is quite legitimate to have more than one paradigm. Yeah? And they could not only be merely symbolic paradigms, but also operational paradigms. Yeah? For example, what I mean, let me give an example. Yeah? You can have, for example, a classical economics or neoclassical economics, which is closely allied to capitalism. Or you could have socialist economics and actually practiced by certain countries such as the former Soviet Union and China in the past. They could actually have different theoretical construction of economics and actually put them into practice, operationalize them. You could have a country like Russia in the past based on system of central planning based on socialist economics. Yeah? And essentially, this also gives a chance for Muslims to articulate their own form of economics, which is Islamic economics. And Muslim scholars have developed their own theories of Islamic economics, which is based on different assumptions. Assumptions like the absence of riba. Yeah? Because in classical Western economics, you have what is known as interest rates. Yeah? And how interest rates is accepted and how it functions within the economic system. But if you have an Islamic system which rejects interest rates, which is riba, then your whole theory of economics would be based on a different premise. Yeah? But that is possible. It is possible. Yeah? You just have a different assumptions, different set of axioms in constructing your economic system. Yeah? Based on non acceptance of interest rates. Yeah? So it's possible to develop a different theoretical system based on different assumptions, just like how it is possible to have different geometrical systems, Euclidean and non-Euclidean, based on different assumptions. So that's possible in the social sciences, and it actually happens in the social sciences. But in the natural sciences, it's difficult to Islamize physics as you can Islamize economics, for example, because the nature of physics or science or the scientific community is such that they only have one paradigm, and the practitioners, the scientific community, practice on. Yeah. So you cannot, for example, different physical theory based on different assumptions, simply to accommodate your religious beliefs, because the criteria there is experimental proof. Yeah. So there's no point articulating a different metaphysical system if it cannot be verified experimentally, and that's the difficulty in trying to create an alternative theoretical system in the natural sciences. So, if you want to have a program of Islamization of science, of natural sciences, then it has to be at the philosophical level. It has to be at the epistemological level. Yeah, as I've illustrated earlier, you have the object level and the meta level, and it's only at the meta level that you can have a different conception of things, of science. Yeah? So the Islamization can still be carried out, but with the understanding that it's a meta level project, not an object level project. Okay.
Thank you so much, Prof. Since our time is up, we invite you for 1 or 2 minute concluding remark, Prof, for today.
Well, as I've suggested in my talk, this is not an easy task. I must admit that it is not an easy task, but it is a task which Muslims must take upon themselves if they're going to claim their own scientific legacy, and they are going to claim their own narrative and chart their own path for their own future. A future which is not necessarily gloomy, which is not necessarily bogged down by all sorts of baggages, historical, metaphysical, and so on. But to take an optimistic view of the future by taking into account all these things that needs to be discussed and addressed as a foundation for the future development of the Muslim Ummah, which I am hopeful for. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. We are so blessed to have you and other